Thanks very much. Thanks for the intro. Like was mentioned, my name is Dan Cunningham. I'm with Fiskars. I'm an engineer at Fiskars. I've been here for about 15 years, and I love to teach about the variety of tools that Fiskars can provide to sewists like you. So let's make sure. All right, my slides are showing. Today, we're here to talk all about sewing. It is the National Sewing Month this month, so we're going to focus on a lot of different sewing tools. But because not every sewist does the same types of projects, we're actually going to highlight categories of people. So I've picked a handful of different styles of people that what are some of the jobs they might do, and picked out some tools that would be ideal for those particular tasks. We'll get to that in a little bit. First, a little bit of an introduction. Fiskars itself is about 375 years old. It is a group of other brands you might have heard of, like Gerber or Itala or even Gingher. But Fiskars also plays in many different categories. You might have a garden tool outside. You might have a cutting pruner that you use. You might even have an axe, and you probably have orange-handled scissors. But Fiskars loves to make a variety of tools in a variety of categories. As I mentioned, I'm an engineer at Fiskars, and I've had my hands in a lot of these products. So I teach tool schools like this as frequently as I can in order to educate consumers. So there are a ton of different sewing tools. You can look at a Michaels and see the wide variety of different kinds. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to break them into just really 3 categories of tools. We're going to say the first is for cutting stuff. That might be cutting thread, cutting fabric, the most common thing, but in some cases even cutting papers or other materials that you might use in the fabric crafts. There's also measuring tools, so rulers or cutting mats. Those are a little more specialized. Someone who's a garment maker might not measure as much as those that are making a quilt block, for instance. There's also some other accessories, so notions or other things that are more specialty to them. We'll pick those out as they come up. But in these 3 categories, we're going to highlight a little bit of each within each of these different types. I'll call them personas here. Each persona, I'm going to start out with an inspirational image of maybe what their workspace might look like. These are not particular pictures of anyone's workspace, and you'll see why in a bit, but they help to inspire the mood of, if you are, say, a garment maker, what that space might look like. So to start out, we might as well start with the garment maker. Their room might look like this. It's got fabrics on many different walls, different setups of busts with lots of in-progress different dresses or pieces of clothing. You probably have a sewing machine. But what you don't see here are many specifics of tools. We at Fiskars do have some tools that we think the garment maker would really love. And those are cutting tools, measuring tools, and some accessories. So highlighting a few here, specifically, the first one I can highlight is the classic orange-handled scissors. The orange-handled scissors have been around forever. These are very great universal scissors. But what is a little different here is the one I'm showing here is not quite exactly the classic orange handle. These are called the RazorEdge scissors. These are a pair of extra sharp sewing scissors. You see they even come with a cover. They're extra sharp scissors that are intended really for fabric only. These extra sharp blades, if you could use them for paper, but they might wear out faster. Whereas if you use them for fabric only, they're going to last you a really long time, last you a lifetime. With real comfortable handles that you all know Fiskars to be, the lightweight of those handles really will get you going quite a ways just with any universal needs that you need for a fabric cutting. Now, there's a couple other tools up here you might not recognize. The first I like to highlight is a small thread snip. This kind of looks interesting, this small thread snip there in the upper right. I'll zoom in a little bit more. This has got an interesting little shape that it's just a circle. It's not a traditional scissor you'd think of, but the idea is you're just going to be able to pinch and cut threads. These sharp edges here will cut threads. In a pinch, you really could cut fabric too. It has no trouble with that. But it's intended as just a handy tool for you to have to just cut bundles of threads, especially around the sewing machine. This extra looped shape back here is actually really handy if you want to tie it on a lanyard, so it can be always around. But it does stay open all the time, so you just have to be careful when you're going to use it. So that's a handy tool. Another one that's up there is, you probably recognize it, a seam gauge. A seam gauge like this will give you the ability to make extra, set a length of your sewing width that you're spacing, and then follow along an edge of fabric. Really mostly used for this garment maker who are doing these seams. But the Fiskars version of it's very handy. Now there's a third one kind of right there that you might not think of as a tool for a garment maker. Let me highlight that one just a second. And this is called the Easy Change knife. So a knife is not something every garment maker is going to have around, but if you see how easy this tool is to use, it's got a cap on here. This is what you would traditionally think of as a craft knife. You'd hold it and you can use it to cut fabrics. Or what's very cool is this set that Fiskars has developed is this Easy Change knife, but it includes specifically sewing tools. So there's a buttonholer where you can just push with it. There's a seam ripper, and then that regular craft knife. Now, what's really cool about this Easy Change setup, you just pull that out and now the blade can come right out. So this is a super handy tool to have nearby just for those little snips, little cuts, buttonholing. You got to pick a seam that you met, a stitch that you made and maybe made a mistake on. But it's not what normal garment makers might think about as having a tool, but I've found it super handy to have around. So that can be purchased just as an individual sewing set, but you can also pick it up in a kit. So a kit that comes with multiple blades, which we'll highlight that in just a little bit. But it comes in a standard kit as well as a heavy duty kit, which again, we'll highlight in a second. So those are some great tools for a garment maker. But what about the people that maybe don't always make sewing with light fabrics? Maybe they are doing something with heavier fabrics. And the heaviest that I can think of is a leather worker. So someone who is making things out of leather. These might be handbags. These might be actual clothing or accessories. But leather in general is really tough to cut. And maybe the scissors and the snips that I was displaying before, those might not be the right tools for the job in this case. So here, if you're a leather worker, there's a different set of tools that I'll highlight. And some of these are going to be more robust, or they're going to do some different, more interesting things that you maybe didn't know you'd need. The first I'll highlight is, in the last one, you didn't see a rotary cutter. But here, now we like to highlight an interesting, different type of cutting. If you're unfamiliar with rotary cutting, rotary blades are essentially razor sharp pizza cutters. They're very, very sharp. They're sharper than even the sharpest pair of scissors. And you use them down onto a cutting mat. So shown up there is an additional kind of that gridded piece. That's a cutting mat. It's self-healing that you can cut right on top of. But the idea with a rotary cutter is you're pushing down and sliding, and the force that you're pushing down with will be able to slice all the way through either one layer of something heavy or even multiple layers. So if you're a quilter, you probably know all about these. They're for cutting many layers of fabric and batting all simultaneously. But these are also really good for heavier materials like leatherworking. I highlighted previously that there is a heavy duty easy change. So down along the bottom here, there is within the kit a heavy duty knife. This knife has bigger blades, and it lets you have a grip that you can then apply more force to when you're cutting down. So this is great for cutting leather, maybe even cutting potentially curves in that leather. And like the other one, this has an easy change too. In this case, you pop this part down and then the blades can come right out. The bigger kit includes multiple pieces, but you really, for a leather worker, they might just use one or two. So if they have the right tools, you might find them in there. Another interesting tool that doesn't really come to mind when you think of most garment making is this one right here. These are eyelet setting punches. Now, eyelets are for more often other types of crafts, but what is very interesting and unique about these tools is they're also hole punching. So the way they work is each of them have a different sized punch blade at the end here, and they're all big springs. So they have a spring right built into it. And the idea is if you have a fabric or a leather or a heavy paper product, and you put this over where you want to cut, pull up on the spring, and I know it's hard to see, but you're pulling up on the spring and go, and it smacks. And by doing it onto a cutting, you cut a hole into that fabric. In this case, it looks like I might have needed more than one. Let's try that again. There you go. Cut the hole right in there. And that hole will be something that you could put an eyelet into, but it's really great for leather as well. So that's kind of a cool tool that you might not think about for regular fabric work or sewing, but when you're leather working, it's important. Now there's one more. I hadn't talked yet about the scissors. Those scissors look kind of funny. I'm a little bit burying the lead here because these are actually one of my favorite tools. These particular scissors, I have a whole page on. So let me advance to the next slide. These are called the Power Cut Shears. Power Cut Shears have a specially shaped blade, kind of that weird, not like a petal, a flower petal shaped blade, but doing that interesting shape lets you be able to cut all the way to the tip with much more force. So it makes cutting leather significantly easier. So I don't have any leather here with me, but what I do have is some very heavy chipboard. So this is really thick, it's a paper product. But if I take a regular orange handled pair of scissors, which are very capable of doing a lot of cutting, but if I try and cut with this orange handled pair of scissors, I can't even get to the tip. It's just too much force. Whereas if I take that same length of cut and cut, it cuts all the way to the tip without much effort. In fact, on our packaging, we say it cuts twice as easy. So that's really exciting for those that are cutting heavy material that may struggle with most types of scissors cutting through that heavy material. So again, that's called the Power Cut Shears. The next persona that I really want to touch on is even a little bit different, but has a lot of similarities to the leather worker. And that might be somebody who does cosplay or makes elaborate costumes. And a lot of times those are done with foams and leathers, and like an EVA foam can simulate leather, but also a lot of different fabrics. So you're making these wearable garments that are often using materials that aren't typical of a regular garment maker. So some of the interesting tools that will highlight them are, again, we've got a rotary cutter up there. So a rotary cutter with a ruler and a rotary mat. We've got, you can see that over there, the craft knife, the easy change craft knife. But this one, I'm actually highlighting the full set because a cosplayer might want longer knives or scalpel shaped blades, things that look different that are going to be helpful for some of those EVA foams. Often cosplayers are using metals, light metals or wires. So Fiskars does make a metal snip with comfortable handles. But the one I really want to highlight here is this other interesting product. It's the scissor. We like to invent a lot of scissors. So the scissor up there is called the Amplify scissor. So let's zoom in a little bit. Amplify scissors look mostly the same as a regular pair of scissors. You know, they've got two handles, they've got two blades, and they've got a joint. But there's an interesting thing going on in here. There's something a little bit different. And what's happening with Amplify scissors is they are designed to cut many layers at once and have an easy time with cutting some harder to cut material. They minimize fabric fold over with a special thing going on with the joint in here. So let me zoom in a bit more here. That fabric will be able to cut layer after layer after layer. Usually, if you're starting to cut many, many layers, you start to have fold over. But you can see, I mean, that was 8 there without any trouble. So this interesting joint allows these scissors to cut many layers and interesting materials without struggling. And that's having to do with the Amplify torsion bar. Won't get into detail, just understand that what's the mechanism that's going on inside there will make sure those blades never spread apart. You never get material that folds in between those blades. So another interesting persona that I like to talk about is a little bit shifted back to the fabric side, but someone who primarily is doing quilts. Quilts look very different than a garment, for instance. And in particular, I'm going to say the geometric quilter, someone who's making geometric quilts, lots of squares, triangles, straight lines. They're going to have a different set of tools than those that will be doing garments with lots of curves to fit around the body and things like that. So the geometric quilter's set of tools might look a little bit different. There, you're going to see not a rotary cutter necessarily in there. Most quilters like to have a rotary cutter on hand, but I have a different product in here to highlight that it is a rotary cutter, but it's also a ruler. But we'll get back to that one. I also want to show off this interesting pair of scissors. This has got a weird shape to it, not what you would normally think of for a regular orange-handled pair of scissors. So let's highlight this. This has got two interesting features going on with this pair of scissors. The first is it is what we call an easy action, which means it doesn't have loops because it's got a built-in spring. This built-in spring lets your hand just close, and then it opens by itself. You can see the spring just pushes that right open. That's great for a couple reasons. The first is it prevents fatigue. It lets you go for longer without tiring. And if you're a quilter making tons and tons of cuts, if you're not using a rotary cutter and you're using a scissor, your hands get tired, guaranteed. And so this easy action allows your hand to go for longer without tiring. Now, the other thing that's interesting, no loops, and why is it weirdly offset like this? Now, these we also call the tabletop scissors. And the reason for that is if you are cutting fabric that you've already laid out onto a table, this is really getting a lot of cuts on it. I should replace it. Especially if you've stacked multiple, you often don't want that material to shift when you're cutting. So you don't want a scissor that lifts very high. So what happens is because this is at an angle like that, it's hard to see at an angle. As you open your hand, the bottom blade never has to leave the tabletop. It can minimize the amount of lift that happens to the fabric because that blade just slides right underneath. And then you can cut and it doesn't disturb the fabric. So that's really interesting and neat and makes it kind of understandable why you have this big angle. But normally when people see this, they might just think, well, that's strange. I wonder why anyone would ever want it like that. So those easy action and tabletop combined together to make something that someone who's a quilter might really enjoy. The other tool, which I alluded to, it's pretty big. You saw in this video. Let me actually move out to, oh, no, let me actually go to the zoomed out view. You can see it's pretty big. In this case, this is a 24-inch version. And it might look familiar in that if you've seen a ruler, a quilting ruler, it's got a quilting ruler on it, but it also has this. In fact, this is a rotary cutter. So if I switch back over and advance to the next slide, this is called the rotary ruler, or the rotary cutter plus ruler combination. This rotary ruler serves the function of both a rotary cutter and a straight line ruler in the same tool. So the idea is you would place it on, you place your fabric, you lay this down on top of your fabric. And then when you zoom out a little bit, when you move this handle engages the blade. So as you push down on it, you can see the blade will push down into the fabric and into that mat and make complete cuts. And this is really handy because it's much, much safer than a regular rotary cutter. Rotary cutters are something you have to always be paying attention to because they are so sharp. But something like this takes a lot of that out of it. So your hand can go right here. There's no way that your blade can slide into your fingers because it's physically attached to that rail. So these are really handy, really interesting, and they come in two sizes. I believe Michaels carries the 6x24. Fiskars also makes a 12x12. They're both really handy and useful. They also, I show a picture of it there. They're also very easy to change the blade. You can take the front part out and there's a magnet that holds the blade in place. So very handy. Another persona is someone that isn't making long straight cuts. They might be primarily doing applique, and that may be applique to upcycle things, applique onto finished goods that they've already made. But when you're doing applique, you're hardly ever making long straight cuts. You're doing more frequently what's called fussy cutting. And so there are some different tools that someone who does a lot of applique might prefer. These are, once again, that orange-handled scissor, the RazorEdge is really good, the nice sharp ones. But there's a couple other tools that are a little different. What does look originally like a regular rotary cutter actually is a little bit different. So the previous rotary cutter I picked up looks like this. In fact, yeah. So it looks about like this. This has a 60 millimeter blade. It's a pretty big blade. It'll let you get through thick materials without any trouble. The one I'm recommending for applique is significantly smaller. So here, this is a 28 millimeter blade. So why would someone who's doing an applique work want a 28 millimeter blade versus a 60? And that has to do with when you're using a rotary cutter, they're primarily intended for straight lines, but the 28 millimeter is actually pretty good at going around curves. So if you have a something that you're trying to cut out, like a circle, with a 28 millimeter, you can make a circle that's only a couple inches wide, and that rotary blade will be able to turn. A 45 or a 60, those don't turn very tightly because the blade is digging into the cutting mat. Its curve will be much wider, so you couldn't make small cuts. But the 28, that's specialty for that sort of thing. So that's really handy when you're going to want to cut around these curves. Now, there's another weird looking tool. Fiskars likes to make some funny looking things for certain reasons, and I'll get to in a second. This gets its own slide, actually. This is a tool specifically designed for what's called fussy cutting. Now, a lot of people have little snips like this, either the Stork snip or the easy action, very small snip. But when you're really making a lot of fussy cuts, like you're cutting a pattern out of a fabric or you're cutting a star, you want a tool that'll let you make those small cuts, but in a repeated way that won't tire you out. This is called the total control scissors. This set of scissors is held differently. It's held with more control. You wrap your whole hand around it so that your hand, instead of your fingertips, are the things that you're getting the control from. So the hand is easily manipulating the scissor. The other cool thing is all of the motion happens in your thumb. That thumb muscle is your strongest muscle in your hand. So that thumb motion is going to let you go and not tire out. So it's a different mechanism than a regular pair of scissors, but you'll find that it's super handy when you're doing a lot of fussy cutting. So that's kind of an interesting additional tool that you might not recognize. A further persona that I want to talk to is someone who might be I'm going to call them a fashionable fixer. This might be a person that isn't heavy into the sewing, but they like to have some tools on hand so that they can fix stuff along the way. Or they have small projects that they may work on, and they particularly like things that look nice. So in this case, this fashionable fixer might be interested in a different set of tools that aren't orange. It's me, blasphemy. It's talking about non-orange handled scissors. But here are a couple scissors that are in fashionable colors, and not just colors, but textures. So the first scissor that you can see right up there, the secret is it is our traditional orange handled scissor, traditional 8-inch orange handle, but with a different color and a different texture. And so if I highlight this one in particular, this is a glitter version, but then there's also other colors. So there's colors and glitter and different fashionable colors. And in fact, there's even a small scissor that can come in matching colors. And what's cool about this small scissor is this is a travel scissor. And this one, I think, is that person who's, occasionally known for I like to fix things. They might have a scissor in their purse. That's this situation. This scissor folds up. It folds up into a tiny area, but then once you unfold it, it's a full 5-inch snip. And this 5-inch snip will do small cutting tasks. It'll do thread snips. It'll just, trim random things that you might just need. But then it takes just seconds to fold it back up into a safe way. So then that safe scissor can be placed back in your purse and in fact, your luggage. These are travel safe. This is TSA approved. So these are some great little scissors that come in multiple colors as well. So fashionable stuff, very cool for that person that might like to have their tools look good at the same time as functional. So I think there's just one more persona that I want to highlight. And that might be the person that wants it all. And I didn't really know how to picture their workspace, so I had made it cluttered. Lots of tools that are things that are there that maybe they want the nicest stuff. So there's definitely some elaborate stuff within there. And Fiskars does make some real high-end things as well, specifically in the side of the business that you might more know as Gingher. So Gingher makes a couple fancy scissors. They are forged scissors. So these 8-inch forged Dressmaker shears, you can see them up there as well. These are forged, very heavy duty, but they will last you generations. I'm aware of consumers that have gotten hand-me-downs from their grandmothers of Gingher scissors, and they function almost as well as they did when they purchased them 40 years ago. So these are some really high-end scissors. They're a little pricier, but they are really nice and will last you a really long time. Additionally, right below those others are some thread snips. Before I showed you these orange-handled thread snips, Gingher also makes a set of thread snips. And like most nice Gingher things, they are also forged. They're forged thread snips that feel heavy duty. They, just like the other ones. Oh, I actually didn't open this one beforehand. And there we go. Had a band on it. Nice forged scissors that have snips that have a finger loop so that you can hold them and still be manipulating other stuff or flip it around behind. I know a lot of people like to do that. It's always on hand, and a good strong spring in there that's hidden so that you can't get tangled in threads, and just a really good clicky feeling. Yes, so kind of a nicer, higher end side of things. There's some other tools here, though, that you might want to invest in if you've already got a regular set of tools that maybe you want to take that step up. And that's specifically this interesting new rotary cutter and rotary cutting mat. So I'll start with the rotary cutter. It has some interesting, cool features that have never been seen before. The first being, why does it look like this? This is a 45mm blade, but clearly it's designed for another size. This is called the dual loop. And the dual loop has a cool mechanism that when you push it, you can push it further. And now you can use a 45mm blade in here, or you can pop this handle up, push it down for a quarter turn. A magnet holds the blade right there. You never have to touch it. And it comes with a it comes with a 60mm blade at the same time. So when you have the case, you can pop your 60mm out, put it in the other hole, and now you have a functional 60mm rotary cutter. So this is a really handy tool to have to be able to switch between the 60s when you're going for long straight cuts, or the 45 when you want a more universal type blade. That makes it, you don't have to touch it, you don't have to, feel and have any issues with that. The other nice thing that easy change does is when you go to replace the blade, Fiskars blade replacements come in a cool little handy thing right here. This is an interesting plastic, but it has a feature built in that it's probably hard to see from here. When you go to change a blade, yeah, it's stuck on a magnet. Oh no, do I have to touch it? No. When you push down, oop, I'm off the screen. If you push down, it falls right off. There is a mechanism that unlocks it from the magnets by pushing it down. Then when you have your replacement blade, you put the hub right there and the magnet picks it up again. So you've just replaced your blade without ever having to touch it. Now, I guess, yes, you have to put this somewhere, but ideally you put that on something that you're going to wrap up and tape up and throw away, or whatever you're going to do, recycle. But you can do so without having to touch that blade. So that's a super handy feature built into that dual loop, that our replacement blades do come with that little tray that has a built-in hole, so you don't have to touch the blades. So that's really handy. The other interesting tool that's related to that dual loop rotary cutter is this mat. This cutting mat is unique. This mat is folding. So there's two different sizes. There is one that folds into thirds and it unfolds out to a 2 foot by 3 foot, kind of the bigger size. And then there's one that folds in half. So the one that folds in half only folds out to a 12 by 18. But when you think about a folding mat, you're like, okay, that actually makes sense. I want to take this to my quilt bee, or I want to take this to my girlfriend's house and go do quilting there. So it makes it a lot more transportable. But there are some issues that might come about when you have a folding mat. Specifically, what about the crease, the seam? Well, we thought of that, and obviously we did some things. Firstly, we put a wavy edge on there. And by making a wavy edge on there, it means that when you're cutting with a rotary blade, you can't fall into the crack. There's no line crack for you to fall into. So that closes up. And even if you try and catch an edge, it's not a straight line. It's always a wave, so you don't fall in. So that wavy edge is super handy. Additionally, it has on the underside some non-slip foam. So a lot of the rotary cutters that we do make are double-sided. Because this is folding, it can't be double-sided. But what we can do is make it so that the rotary mat doesn't slip, which is handy for a lot of people. Sometimes by making this double-sided, it makes it more slippery on the table. And so that can be a downside. So the non-double-sided mats, the ones that are folding, have a non-slip foam layer built right into it. So that actually covers the personas that I wanted to talk about. And I mean, you can see I already talked about a lot of different types of tools, but it took me, I'm at about 35 minutes at this point, and I should have time for questions that have come up. I can kind of see the chat, but Kayla, you're in here. I may have to rely on you to ask me some of the questions that might have shown up. So thank you for your time.
We have speaking about RazorEdge scissors and
yes.
You can show them our universal sharpener.
Very good. Yes. So I don't have it with me, but the universal sharpener is a special sharpener that Fiskars makes that adapts to the razor sharp edge of our RazorEdge scissors. A typical pair of scissors has what is known as the blade grind. That's the angle that the blade face and the part that does the cutting, what that angle is. Most of them have matching angles. So most sharpeners are fine to use. The RazorEdge actually have unmatching angles. One of these is a much sharper edge than the other. And if you try and put it in one of those kind of over-the-counter, off-the-shelf type of sharpeners, they will damage the tool. But the fancy RazorEdge sharpener is adapting to these two blade grinds and will sharpen it without damaging it. So that's a tool that Fiskars designed because we've seen a lot of issues with people not understanding the RazorEdge and that they can damage those blades. So that sharpener is really a specialty tool that's great for that case. Oh, of course. Yeah. Let me see if I can zoom. I don't have a ton of, I mean, it's a fixed focus camera, unfortunately, so I can't really change the focus, but you can see the way this works is as you open, you can see there's the two loops overlap when they're closed, but when you open them, they flip around all the way to the bottom and lock into place. And so now you've got a pair of scissors that when you open it are a regular pair of scissors. When to close them, you hold the back side of the blade on one side to get it started. And then once that's started, you can then squeeze them together to fully close them the rest of the way. So I know the lighting's not perfect here. I picked a dark colored scissor, unfortunately. I hope that was helpful.
Next question was, which one is good for embroidery work? And I suggested the 4-inch curved scissor. But do you have any other?
Yes, that's a great one. That is probably the one I was going to point out. We have a specialty embroidery one. If you want to go take a step up, there is the classic Stork, the Gingher Stork, which I believe is on michaels.com, but I'm not sure about that, so I didn't point it out. But that is another good one. I do like that curved embroidery scissor though for really doing those great, being able to embroider and then cut The curved means that you can cut really close and flush to the fabric without leaving any of the strings.
There's a question, could you differentiate between tailor scissors and traditional fabric scissors? They look the same, the prices are different.
I may have to look that one up. I don't know which scissor we call tailor scissors. If I'm thinking about it, I think there is a 9-inch longer scissor that we call tailor shears. Those, oh, are they thinking, oh, they might be talking about the classic, the made in Finland. Those are called tailor shears. Yes, good. Yes, thank you. That is right. Okay, so there are 2 different versions of Fiskars orange handled scissors that look very similar, but they are actually different. The more traditional orange handled scissor that I've had up here and I set down, oh, here they are. These are a slightly different plastic. They are a little lighter weight and they are a little less expensive, but they call these other ones these tailor shears. These are actually made in Finland using a more handcrafted expertise, and they're a little bit of a step up in quality. Not that you would really notice much if you're doing everyday tasks, but if you're a really specialty sewist that knows your scissors inside and out, you might be able to detect a little bit of a difference in the smoothness, or maybe the feel of the handles are a little bit different. They're both great performing scissors, but that's why that tailor scissor might be a little higher in price. Hope that's helpful.
Those are all the questions we had in the chat. We've got a fun story from Sharon.
Oh,
That her husband just discovered this in our hand from her buried in the garden. And they were transplanting and he couldn't even look like this.
wow. Yes, yes, the longevity and the quality of Fiskars tools, we can stand behind them. I mean, lifetime warranties, like they're great. You know, they are some of the best products out there in the categories. I'm proud to have been working here for 15 years and hope for more. So oh, I don't have one. There is a step-by-step, I believe, on our website that we can link to. I'm not sure if the Michaels website includes that step-by-step, because it's kind of buried as an instructions. It's like an instructional thing that comes on the ruler connector within I think it's a piece of paper that comes in the package, and it gives you a step-by-step on how to do it. I wish I could demonstrate it. And unfortunately, the new video studio that, if you've ever seen any of my other schools, we're in a new place, and in the past it's been surrounded by tools. Now I had to bring all of them into the video studio. So I think we'll try and follow up with with some sort of thing, hopefully. But otherwise, just looking up online, those ruler connectors, there is, I think, a step-by-step pictorial guide somewhere. Yes, is that Jennifer asking about it? Yes, play with it. Yeah, it is kind of a finicky little thing, but hopefully that step-by-step guide might give you additional guidance too. A link to the Stork. Okay, cool. My computer's way over there. Very good, very good. I saw it. There's the Stork embroidery scissors. Well, I'm happy to hear that people have had good experience with Fiskars. I hope that this presentation has opened your eyes to other types of tools you might not either understand or even know exist. That's what my tool schools are supposed to be all about. So I'm happy to be able to provide some of that for people. Appreciate the time that you've taken, and thank you.
I just want to make sure that was a wrap or not. I wasn't sure. Let me know. And then I can end it here.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, everyone.